That's it. Okay, thank you. Before we get on to Andrew's presentation. So thank you. Those are the basic rules of engagement. So what I'd like to do is now introduce Andrew. Andrew Bennett is the Deputy Director General for Queensland Government Procurement, and that's within the Department of Housing and Public Works, I believe. Andrew has a long and distinguished history in IT, procurement and education. And so he's in fact in an ideal position to work on the overall procurement, which is a very large activity for procurement for the Queensland Government. Obviously, Andrew looks at all of them. We're asking him to concentrate today on the ICT related bits because that's our audience. And if you haven't seen it, it's not a very, you can't see it properly there, but there's a new booklet and he'll talk about it, which is, I have to commend him for saying that this new policy is straightforward and succinct. And that's what I think many people have been looking for. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Andrew, who will now present to us. And then, as I say, questions put in the chat, please, and Simon will ask Andrew those questions at the end. Thank you. Over to you, Andrew.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Nick. And the first thing I'm going to do is break all of the rules that I learned at UQ decades ago about doing presentations. I'm going to share some slides. I have rather a lot of them, but I plan to skip through them relatively quickly. So please let me know when you can see the slides. All good?
Yes.
All good.
Excellent. Righty-ho. Okay. So look, let me start, as we always do, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands from which I am joining you today, as well as those variously around the state. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us in the meeting today. So why is procurement important? Bit of a boring subject really for people who've been in IT, but the reason it's important is procurement is the vehicle through which government controls around about $35 billion worth of spend each year on goods and services. A significant proportion of that is in the ICT category. So one of the things that the government did as part of their election campaign was make a commitment to ensuring that they value taxpayers' money and that they seek to achieve the best possible outcome for the expenditure of public money. And ultimately, that's why we ended up with a new procurement policy, which will commence on the 1st of January 2026, not that far away. And importantly, the policy will apply to procurement activities conducted by all agencies. So the policy is intended to define a unified approach to procurement across all of the categories. We want to make sure that no matter whether you're spending money in ICT or construction, social services, general goods and services, and so on, that you're doing so under the same rules. And as part of government's approach, we're looking to reduce the amount of red tape that's involved in a procurement. Typically, procurements take a long time. For those of you who've had the opportunity to respond to government tenders, you're probably aware of the copious documents and forms that we make you fill out, the number of artefacts that we make you submit, the extensive and exhaustive questionnaires through online tendering. And one of the things that we've sought to do within the process of developing the new QPP is to shorten that cycle time to make it easier to fill out and ultimately give us a chance at arriving at a better outcome. Hence the mantra there, simpler, faster, better. That's my 3-word encapsulation of what QPP 2026 is about. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what we're trying to achieve is a better outcome for government, which results in a better outcome for Queenslanders who we serve. Now, this is an important slide if you're in the construction sector, obviously, because we've removed the best practice industry conditions. But if you're in other categories, such as the ICT industry, it's equally relevant because the best practice industry conditions are part of what was formerly known as the best practice principles. It's a series of rules, practices, and threshold tests that apply to procurement across all government procurement categories, and including ICT. And one of the reasons that we repealed it, of course, was that it was considered to be highly restrictive. It was a highly punitive regime. It was targeted at compliance and punishment. And we've replaced it with something called the procurement assurance model, which I'll talk a little bit about soon. So at a glance, QPP. And we've gone from over 700 pages down to 52. That's a pretty significant reduction, achieved mostly through the elimination of duplication or conflicting information. There's a lot of repealing of existing unnecessary documents and then restructuring it with plain, easy-to-read language into 5 main sections. We've certainly tried wherever we can within the document to increase the amount of clarity and also provide some very clear direction about which clauses apply to which entity types. We've reduced the number of principles within the policy itself, whilst retaining the overall focus on fiscal discipline and driving outcomes and value for Queenslanders. So breaking it down a little bit, you've got 5 key areas. The Queensland procurement approach, which is in essence the why. What are we doing? What are the targets? What are the outcomes? Part 2 are the procurement rules, how we're actually going to do it. Part 3, as I said, is the replaced procurement assurance model. And Part 4 and 5 are a glossary of terms and then a record of changes. One of the interesting things about QPP 2026 is it's designed to be a living document. That means we can amend it on the fly without having to go through a complicated cabinet process. In fact, if you looked at the version of QPP which is available online today, you'll notice that we've already recorded a number of changes to the document decisions of government to expand or amplify certain clauses within the policy so that you can have confidence that at any point in time you can see exactly what the current state is going to be and you know exactly what the rules are you're playing under. So the procurement approach, really it's broken up into 5 key areas. Number 1, first and foremost, is about value for Queensland, making sure that we are delivering value for taxpayers' dollars and ensuring that there are open and fair opportunities to compete for being part of government supply chain. Pillar 2 remains a key focus for government, making sure that we develop and deliver opportunities for local and family businesses, particularly small businesses and regional enterprises where practical. Pillar 3 is about being easier to do business. Pardon me, simplifying the process and removing some of the barriers to actually engaging with government. Pillar 4 is about being open to new ideas, signifying that government remains committed to innovation, looking for different approaches to solve those critical problems that government faces. And lastly, Pillar 5 is about ensuring that we use procurement to deliver practical, economic, environmental and social impact. That could be about developing sustainable procurement practices, building a diverse supplier base, including support for social enterprises, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses. And it's about procurement that creates positive impacts just beyond the immediate purchase. You'll notice as we go throughout the policy that there's a real focus on moving from an output to an outcome. And if there's one change that I could make for the 6,500 procurement people around government, it's to make that shift of thinking. No longer are we all consumed with the process of getting to the end. We're actually really more interested in what does the outcome look like. And if I can help my team, my tribe, make that shift in culture, then I think we're a long way towards successful implementation of the policy. None of these individual pillars stand alone, of course. They all work together to drive the outcomes described in the approach. These provide the foundation that the rest of the policy from parts 2 through to 5 sit on. And whether you're a procurement officer planning a tender or a supplier responding to one of these, you'll be able to see exactly what these Queensland Government priorities and commitments are driven. Too far. So procurement rules. The rules are what actually defines how we're going to do it. And you'll notice as you go through the policy that we've really simplified and settled on 3 key approaches to the rules. Obviously, there is a must, a mandatory requirement which agencies are required to comply with. There's a should, which we recognise as being best practice. Agencies are strongly encouraged to apply this principle where they can. And then there's a may, which is a more discretionary term, open to interpretation and application by agencies in line with their risk tolerance and what risk allowances are made within individual agencies. We've also made it clear within the rules where there are sections that are being applied selectively to some of the government entities. There is a very small number of entities for whom some of the rules are entirely discretionary, mainly around reporting. So that would be, for example, if you are a government-owned corporation or a certain select amount of statutory bodies, typically the ones that are owned jointly by government and local government authorities. But otherwise, the rules apply to all departments, agencies, statutory bodies, government corporations and special purpose vehicles. We've also condensed the number of procurement principles from 6 down to 4, and you'll see the 4 on the screen there. The first of those is around deriving value for money through purposeful public procurement, which is about balancing that cost with the economic, environmental and social outcomes to ensure that procurement contributes more broadly to government priorities within a fiscally disciplined framework. The second principle is about ethical and transparent behaviour, making sure that suppliers who are engaged with government are delivering what we've asked them to do under the contract, whilst ensuring that they also behave ethically within the supply chain and that they make sure that they're paying people what they need to do, what they need to pay and compliant with all of the laws and regulations. Principle 3 is about collaboration and capability. We're envisaging that agencies and suppliers work together, share knowledge, and engage early to build a stronger and more capable procurement workforce and build better partnerships with our suppliers. The last principle, of course, is good governance and planning, ensuring that a strong governance model sits over the top of the procurement processes to make sure that government and industry get the expected outcomes that we're trying to deliver from it. So a couple of key changes to the rules, and if you're in the ICT space, some of these will be particularly of interest to you. We've introduced a number of competitive process exemptions. What we found through our consultation processes earlier this year was that agency application of the existing procurement policy was, let's be fair, not always even. It was inconsistent. And you could find an agency having a threshold for significant procurement planning as low as $50,000 and some agencies having a threshold in the millions. Some agencies would have a threshold for requiring multiple quotes in the hundreds of thousands, and some of them would have it for anything over $5,000. This was an extremely inefficient way to conduct business and also made it very, very confusing for industry who were trying to respond to government. It wasn't clear when you were responding to a procurement approach or an opportunity whether you were competing against one or multiple suppliers, or how long the process was going to be, what sort of detail would be required, which ultimately ended up making the processes both more costly, more burdensome, and taking longer. So we have set some whole of government minimum thresholds for competitive processes now. A minimum of $50,000. If it's below $50,000 and you're buying off a common use supply arrangement, one quote, do no more, off you go. In terms of planning for significant procurement, unless it's at least $500,000, don't undertake planning for significant procurement. The PSP process can actually add up to 3 or 4 months to a procurement activity. And when we had procurements taking up to 9 to 12 months to complete, that was in nobody's benefit and ultimately ended up asking suppliers to undertake a significant amount of additional work to demonstrate that they were meeting all of the requirements that were set out within your PSP. We've also introduced a much stronger focus on category management, enhancing and elevating the role of category councils to ensure that the delivery of QPP is cascading all the way down through to the agency plans and ultimately in the procurement activities that you see coming to market. I've got a slide a little bit further on in the deck which will talk about that. So there's a couple more of those actions. One of the others that we've said is that if there is a common use supply arrangement that's been established, its use is now mandated. And what we're hoping to do is move away from having multiple conflicting arrangements in any individual category or sometimes across categories. One of the really easy ones is to think about the way that the building and construction sector manage the application of supply arrangements for trade contractors. You ended up having 3 different agencies in 3 different categories trying to run supply arrangements for the same sorts of services that were being provided. Terribly inefficient, terribly confusing, and ultimately not really delivering the value that we're looking for from government by having a single arrangement. So the other change that we've made in terms of the application of category policies is that where a category has defined a standard contract template, its use is now mandated. So for you in ICT, the ICT category has defined a new version of QITC. Use of that new policy and that new category templates will be mandated for anyone seeking to procure ICT goods or services. We want to ensure that when agencies are extending or renewing arrangements, that they have actually evaluated supplier performance against those contractual commitments that have been made. Too often have we heard stories in other categories, such as social services, where suppliers are being renewed and arrangements rolled over simply because it was more efficient from a timing point of view than to go through a refresh process. No longer. We're expecting and requiring that everyone who manages an arrangement will undertake a rigorous process for evaluating supplier performance before they renew those arrangements, and that there is a timely and appropriate refresh cycle for all of those arrangements, particularly where they are mandated as a common use supplier arrangement, to ensure that we have appropriate and adequate supplier refresh and opportunities for new entrants to join those arrangements throughout the life of the panel. As I've said, we've also ensured that category councils have a much more active role in looking at the way their arrangements are structured, including a requirement that only category councils can approve the establishment of a common use supply arrangement to avoid diluting that pool of suppliers where we have been to the trouble of planning and taking an arrangement to market and testing it. One of the other changes that we've introduced is something called purposeful public procurement. This is an approach whereby we're seeking to ensure that all of the environmental, social, economic and sustainability outcomes are still being delivered through government procurement, but without overweighting and overburdening any individual activity. Previously, if you were responding to a government tender, even in the ICT space, you might be asked to tell a story of how your business or how your contract would support the delivery of local benefits, including local workforces and local suppliers. You might be asked about what you're doing for small and family businesses or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses. You might be asked about a whole range of things. In fact, the way that tenders used to work was that inevitably agencies, in their efforts to try and satisfy all of these multiple commitments from government, would typically ask for 6 or 7 individual procurement outcomes, meaning that suppliers had to provide an enormous amount of information and effectively within the evaluation criteria, devaluing or weighting each of those individual criterion at such a low level that they were individually insignificant and ultimately not really serving the purpose. So the idea of PPP outcomes is that agencies can now choose a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 4, with a minimum aggregate weighting of 10% and a maximum aggregate weighting of 20%. So what that means is if we're undertaking a significant procurement, and if you refer to my earlier slide, that's something with a value of $500,000 or more, we might ask you to talk about some of these outcomes. Importantly, agencies can now choose the individual ones that they want on an individual procurement. So if I think about my former Department of Education and they were undertaking a school build in Doomadgee, you might be asked to talk about the support that this would provide for Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander businesses. You might be asked to talk about environmental outcomes, including a reduction in waste or an increase in the use of locally recycled materials. If you were talking about an activity that was occurring in Townsville, you might be asked to talk about how the process would increase spend with Queensland suppliers that are owned by or that employ veterans or that support the veteran transition from ADF to civilian employment. Now, we did a lot of research as part of developing the policy, and as far as we're aware, no one outside the UK or the US provides any direct support through government procurement for businesses that are owned by or employ veterans from our Defence Force. So particularly when you think about the activity that occurs in Townsville, or indeed throughout the state of Queensland, where we have the largest population of resident veterans of any state in Australia, an opportunity for agencies to preference tenders towards organisations that are supporting veterans is quite significant and appropriate recognition of the critical role that those individuals play within the state's economy. We might be talking about enduring community value or a range of any one of these other PPP outcomes in the tenders. Importantly, agencies are also required to disclose the individual weightings and the scores that they have assigned against each of the PPP outcomes. So there will be an opportunity for industry to have a direct and obvious feedback on how their responses have scored and how they've contributed ultimately to the end outcome for that particular procurement. So as I said, we have clarified and strengthened and elevated the role of category councils. Included within that are a series of standardised category plans and strategies now, which will be published online. So everyone will have the opportunity to understand how individual categories are going to behave, what approaches they're going to bring to market, what the pipeline looks like for that category. So there'll be ample forewarning now when opportunities are coming to you through the new Tenders website to give you time to respond and make sure that those opportunities that you are interested in are the ones that you're able to compete for. We've also elevated the role of a couple of our other advisory committees. We have a Procurement Ministerial Advisory Council, and each of the categories, including ICT, will now be expected to have a robust and well-staffed industry reference group who will be providing direct input into the development of the category strategies on a continuing basis. Part 3 is the procurement assurance model. You might recall that I talked earlier about replacing BPICs and BPPs. The role of the procurement assurance model is to actually ensure that the contracts that we are committing to are delivering the outcomes that government is seeking and then providing value back to the state. PAM consists of 3 major elements. There is an accountability model, which I've just talked about. There's a capability model, which replaces the former punitive compliance regime and penalties-based structure. If, for example, through the process of assessing a contract, it's determined that a commitment isn't being met for anything other than the most egregious of offences, what happens is that agency and government will work to support that supplier through a series of capability development activities, as well as the agencies involved. Ultimately, this will be material that's delivered either by my team or through a series of other industry external engagements, people like Business Chamber Queensland and other groups, to ensure that suppliers are able to meet their contractual commitments. Only in the most egregious circumstances would a suspension or a termination regime be brought into play. The third part of the PAM is an incentive-based scheme which will commence from 1st of January 2027. Through this, government seeks to reward and encourage those suppliers who are doing the right thing, who are delivering on time, on budget, or better yet, ahead of budget, with opportunities to provide early access to tenders or some other scheme. Oops, lost the lights in my room. And we'll be developing that in consultation with industry over the next 9 months. So you can look forward to seeing some more about that through the industry reference group for the ICT Category Council. There's a quick comparison on the slides from the previous ethical supplier mandate versus the PAM. Importantly, though, one of the things that we did notice under the old ethical supplier mandate, of the 30-odd matters that were brought forward to government, there were no challenges, no changes to those particular outcomes. And importantly, over $800,000 of money that should have been paid to Queenslanders by those suppliers was actually repatriated or repaid. So good outcomes at the end of the day, but the scheme itself, the ESM scheme, was too restrictive and considered to not really operate in a way that we wanted under the new QPP. So alongside the new QPP, Government and Cabinet approved a better data, better decision strategy, or a new procurement data strategy. The vision of this strategy was to enhance government's ability to access the procurement data that we collect to drive smarter, faster and fairer procurement decisions and provide better quality data and analytics to drive procurement insights. So over 3 tranches, we've got a number of projects which are being developed and delivered by government over the next 3 years. Obviously, we're looking to leverage automation and AI to enhance our data quality, but we're also looking to use AI to improve the productivity of our procurement processes, making them simpler and easier to access. We've done a lot of work initially looking at how we increase the quality of the data that we have to drive better decisions and to give government better visibility of where and how we spend our data. My data and insights team is currently presenting at 2 international AI conferences on some of the work that we've done to enhance the quality of the more than 29 million lines of transactions that we collect every year from Queensland Government agencies. Adopting a standard nomenclature for procurement data spend has enabled us to have a much more effective and transparent view of where the data tells us people are spending their money, which enables us to produce better procurement strategies and ultimately drive better outcomes in terms of the delivery of those services back to the Queensland public. Skip over those. A couple of other changes under the new data strategy: a new Q-Tenders website, mobile friendly for a start, and the introduction of supplier badging. So what we've done is tapped into external certification providers to provide easy, visible indicators for our buyers of to which companies are now attributed towards which outcomes. For example, if you are a social enterprise, there'll be a badge that says you are a social enterprise. If you're an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander enterprise, there'll be a badge to indicate that status. And similarly for a number of other categories. This is really important because when agencies are seeking to advance some of those PPP outcomes, you'll be able to see on our Q-Tenders tool now which agencies are already active and operating in that sector to maximise your chances of inviting relevant suppliers to any of your tendering opportunities. The procurement solution that we've been deployed, the vendor panel-backed product, will remain. Government agencies will use that new Q-Tenders platform to publish and conduct their tenders processes. Suppliers, of course, still need an account to download documents and submit their responses. But importantly, the tool is now being used to support the delivery of a number of other government priority commitments. So the Small Business Procurement Commitment, which has now been replaced by the Small Business Procurement Action Statement, will require suppliers to register on the Q-Tenders solution so that they can be registered for early payment if they're a small business under the small business or the on-time, every-time payment commitment. And that's the commitment that government has made through the Department of Customer Service, Open Data, Small and Family Business to pay small businesses immediately if under 10,000 or within 3 days. So if you're a supplier on the call, you should register on this portal and create a business profile so that your business is not only visible to government buyers, so that you're also visible for things like the on-time, every-time payment commitment. For the first time ever, we are publishing a public spend portal. This is a collection of all of the aggregate procurement data that we get from agencies every quarter. At the moment, you'll see it's covering about $28 billion worth of spend. And if you recall one of my early slides, we talk about government's total procurement spend being $35 billion. We are currently in the process of working with those agencies who aren't currently covered to provide a data collection process through an API to get your data, get it into the spend portal, and then use that to drive both our insights and to report publicly. When we first talked about this portal with our minister, he said this will be the first time we've ever actually talked to this level of detail about where the spend is going. And of course, because it's a nice Power BI dashboard, you can drill down by both category and area and look at where the spend is landing, with whom, and see exactly what's going on. By the time you drill a little bit further down under the UNSPSC coding, you can start to break down information and communication technology spend into individual subcategories and components and start to get a real idea of where government is actually buying, with what, from whom. So just to close out again, $35 billion worth of procurement spend. We want to make sure that procurement spend targets and supports regional economies. We want to make sure that we continue to provide open opportunities for small and family businesses, and that we've encouraged agencies to break that spend up into digestible chunks, to which individual suppliers can then apply. We've retained the 30% target for participation of small and medium enterprises across the totality of government contracts, plus some complementary regional and subcontractor measures for individual areas. We've retained the 3% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander business procurement spend. Recalling that for the first time last year, we actually tipped over that. That's the first time in 15 years. And we're seeking to drive through our PPP outcomes an increase in spend with female-owned businesses, social enterprises, and for the first time ever, businesses that are owned by veterans. And lastly, we're going to make sure that government is both visible and accountable in terms of the strategies that we're employing and the outcomes we're meeting by publishing those category strategies and making sure that we have public, transparent government spend profiles so that you can see exactly what the policy is doing and hold us accountable for what we've considered. A very, very quick run through what's normally about an hour's presentation. There's a little QR code on the screen if you want to find more. But hopefully what I've done is leave enough time for questions, and hopefully people have been thinking about that on the way through and sent some to Simon. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thank you very much for that presentation. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's not possible for us to just unmute ourselves, and it won't be efficient to do that and ask questions. Please send the questions, put the questions on chat, and Simon is sitting there in mission control on the Sunshine Coast, sorting out all those questions, and is now about to ask Andrew your questions. Can I pass Simon? Can you go?
Hi. Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. And thank you, Andrew, for that presentation. That was great. Okay, I do have a few questions. We probably will have space for a few more. So get your fingers typing, and some people already have. Okay, I'll pick those up as we go. But to start with, in the ICT industry, we've always seen a tension between the desire of the industry to be innovative and the need for procurement officers to be both even-handed when evaluating proposals and compliant with whatever the rules are. And looking at this from the perspective of the industry, it often feels like this simply devolves to a box-ticking exercise, and innovation is sort of pushed aside. I applaud your desire to shift this, but how will you make that happen?
So one of the changes we made very early on within the policy was to remove the requirement to submit a conforming bid before you submit an innovative response. So too often in the past, government would come up with a specification because we think we know how a problem needs to be solved, and we'd say, you've got to tell us how you're going to do this before you can tell us whether or not you've got a different solution. So we have now deliberately encouraged organisations who think they have a better way of solving one of government's problems to come forward with an innovative approach. Agencies are expressly required to consider every innovative approach and determine whether or not it in fact offers a better way of solving the problem that they've sought to go to the market to meet. And they're required to provide feedback to any organisation that has submitted an innovative response, irrespective of whether that response was successful or not in being awarded as the preferred tenderer. We've also worked pretty hard with our colleagues in the Department of Innovation to come up with some new guidance for individual procuring officers around how to treat and evaluate innovative responses. And we've also going to use the data that we're collecting from agencies to try and drive insights into the impact of government's innovation policies. I'm really interested in what the innovation life cycle looks like for organisations that might have been a recipient of one of the innovation grants from DETSI. Have they gone on to do anything beyond the grant? Have they actually won a tender with government? What's happened to their size? How much spend have they had? So that we start to understand and track the life cycle of organisations at a much deeper level than we'd ever been able to do previously, and then tie that back to where are they procuring and are they actually getting any of the business that government's taking to market.
Okay, thank you. Next question. This questioner asks, I have a question on the competitive process exemptions. How will you ensure that this doesn't just turn into a small collection of effective monopolies?
Yeah, look, good question. So one of the reasons that we've established the exemption process is what we noted when we've actually done some of our analysis, that relatively low value transactions seem to attract a lot of process. So we've tried to take some of the time out of that. But we're expecting also that the exemptions for competitive process apply only where there has been an effectively market-tested arrangement. So by having a market-tested arrangement, we're hoping that we are potentially providing enough competitive opportunity to ensure that it's not just one or two suppliers on the arrangements. And by having a regular refresh process around the arrangements, we're hoping that we'll avoid the establishment of long-term lockout for the market with one or two monopolies. But at the end of the day, government's role is to deliver goods and services to the people of Queensland. Part of that is trying to ensure that we have an active market, but we're also responsible ultimately to the public to derive the most effective outcomes for the spend for the public dollars that we are spending. So there is a bit of a balance in there, and hopefully the category councils, through their oversight of those arrangements, will be able to strike a better balance than we've seen in the past, particularly in the ICT space, where it is easily prone to the establishment of some of those monopolies.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned that this policy is now capable of, it's very agile, can be changed quickly. But of course, if you're a company bidding, every bidding exercise is expensive. Hopefully less so with the new regime, but still expensive. So what sort of dampening are you going to put on policy changes? I'd hate to get halfway through a submission and then find that all the rules have changed and we've got to start again and again.
That's a really great question. If I reflect on, and I've been doing government procurement since 2011, this has been the most significant change that I've ever seen to a procurement policy anywhere in this country. We're not anticipating a lot of change. They're likely to be minor tweaks like the one that we saw within 2 weeks of the policy being introduced to reflect an enhancement to the application of things like recycled content. That's not to say government can't change things. Government obviously reserves the right to move its direction. But we're not expecting significant policy change to occur any more frequently than once a year. I'd be surprised if it occurred more frequently than that. But the process is there. And just for anyone who hasn't, I know some of you work in government, the process of getting from ideation through to a cabinet decision is typically 9 to 12 months. If we can make that process faster, then I'd be pretty happy. Obviously, the policy isn't open to capricious change either. There does have to be a degree of consultation, and ultimately any change to the policy has got to be agreed between my minister and the Premier. So there are a few safety nets in place.
Okay, thank you. Right, someone who obviously works on the consulting side of the IT industry says, many fixed price consulting assignments tend to extend far longer than specified and quoted. The client, their boss, their boss's boss may all in turn review final report, then their stakeholders look at it, then changes are needed. And so the consultant ends up putting in a lot more work than was initially contracted for. Clients, says this person, can become very insensitive to the amount of work they're asking for versus paying for. Are we looking to measure client performance as well as vendor performance? Cheeky.
I love that as a question. One of the things that I'm expecting is we should always be open to transparent feedback about how we are going, and that's one of the reasons we're publishing our spend portal. I would absolutely look forward through the relevant category councils and the industry reference groups to have a feedback mechanism. Now, I understand, of course, the sensitivities around naming and shaming people, so we'd want to have a look at how we would develop either an anonymous mechanism or a mechanism where feedback could be provided in confidence. It's a great suggestion. I'll take it on board and we'll start to consider how it might operate.
Okay, thank you. Right, someone says, the portal is a great idea. Can we get the ongoing ICT overall spend totals? We would love access to this information to ensure the level of ICT spend is relevant to the needs of government, and information-based business delivering, and being an information-based business delivering important customer service.
So
I hope that makes sense. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Obviously, that data is available through the open data portal right now. You can have it anyway. We've just collected it and applied it in a way that we think makes more sense. We expect to be updating that portal on a quarterly basis, so you will see the spend going through that portal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Somebody asks, thanks for the update on the QPP. When will organisations currently excluded from ICT GGS 0111-24 and other preferred supplier panels be given an opportunity to join these panels? I'm specifically requesting a response based on an organisation's ability to support PPP on your slide 10, namely in the area of female-owned, ATSI-owned, employer of veterans, and an SME.
So I've been working with each of the teams that I'm part of, and I sit on all of the category councils to try and come up with a sensible cadence for refresh to the panels. Obviously, we need to respect the work that has been put in by suppliers to get onto those panels, and we don't want to be having a million people jumping onto a panel. I absolutely don't want to repeat some of the sins of New South Wales in that respect. But we are expecting a reasonably active and frequent refresh. We always have the opportunity for a lateral entry, particularly where we feel that there is insufficient numbers of suppliers in one of those priority areas. I'm expecting, for example, if someone's noticed GGS 011124, I'm expecting a refresh process around March for that one next year, but only in specific areas.
Alrighty. Here comes a question based on my personal experience. Once upon a time, I was the chair of the AIIA in Queensland and very involved when the Newman government came to power in working on exactly this problem. And there was a lot of talk at ministerial level about shifting procurement culture, working more quickly, encouraging SME innovation, and so on and so forth. The problem was that was all very well and good at the high level, but at the lower level of the individual procurement officers, nothing changed effectively. So we had rhetoric here, obfuscation there, if you see what I mean. So what will this government and your office as well be doing to shift procurement culture so that the individuals who are actually doing the work, I don't want to really say buy in because I don't mean that, but their minds get shifted to the point where they actually understand and commit to and try and create these changes that you're talking about, because there's a huge amount of inertia behind the old processes and it isn't going to be easy to change that.
You're absolutely right. And that's one of the reasons government gave us a 3-year period to actually become fully compliant with policy. Part of that is recognising that some of the organisations we deal with are very large, very geographically dispersed and frankly quite difficult to move. But obviously there are parts of government which can move far more quickly. They're more agile when it comes to changing their process. And we have some exemplars of pretty good practice now, if you look at parts of TMR, for example, and some of the other agencies. So what we've done is taken a lot of the lessons that those agencies have learned as they've been going through their own journey of maturity and developed a capability and maturity framework against which we can now measure individual agencies' maturity and then provide a series of stepped lessons, capability uplift, training opportunities, and then, frankly, systems and support to help those agencies move further along the curve. There's also a lot of work with significant decision makers in agencies to change the way that we think about risk, because one of the reasons that procurement people have been the way they are for the last 20 years is procurement's been an exercise in shifting risk. Now, I didn't dwell on it in my presentation today, but one of the things that government has given us a very clear mandate on is to adopt a more balanced appetite towards risk. It's no longer a case of trying to shift all of the risk onto the supplier. So when an agency isn't solely focused about making sure that everyone understands that they've done everything they possibly can to move all of the risk, we start to talk about a more shared set of outcomes. A more appropriate allocation of risk means procurement officers can start to think about other things within the process. And by measuring how well we're achieving some of those other indicators, we can start to bring to life those opportunities for agencies who are doing better to be showcased and then to drive some of those efficiencies. The other thing that we've done is, and we will talk about it as under the data strategy, is start to use smarter systems to take some of the grunt work out of procurement. if you're spending your entire day focusing on driving low-level transactional behaviours, you're not thinking about your procurement in a way that's strategic. You're not thinking about your procurement in a way that's going to drive some of those outcomes that might be engaging with innovative approaches. So by taking some of that minutiae away from the individual purchasing officers, we're hopefully giving them time to think more strategically about their role and apply their mindset and their professional skills in a different way to drive some of those outcomes in a different direction.
Okay, thank you. So here's a strategic question. Will this policy apply to local government as well?
No, local government is a different beast. And whilst we share the vendor panel platform, government this time has no appetite to force the new QPP onto local government. That's not to say they can't apply many of its precepts. In fact, many local government agencies like to use our panels, but no, we're not intending to force local government to use the policy at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, just before I ask this question, the buffer is getting a little empty here, guys. So if you are sitting there burning to ask a question, whack it in the chat now, please. Okay, what impact do you think the Olympics is going to have on all of us? I'm beginning to feel that the Olympics are coming towards us like a runaway train. And are we going to be agile enough to actually cope?
Great question. I spent a lot of time dealing with matters related to Olympics procurement of late, and obviously I know Rod McRuby and his team very well. The Olympics are going to be the biggest game in town in 2032, as Rob likes to say in his presentation, 5 billion eyes on the state of Queensland. But 2032 is it's a fair way away, comparatively speaking. And let's not get too caught up in it. The Olympics, all told, it's probably $10 billion worth of spend. So everyone's really focused on the Olympics: stadia, venues, villages, transport. Yahoo! That's great. Focus on the 10 billion, but also focus on the 35 billion that we spend every year. So that's $35 billion by Queensland Government every year between now and 2032. And when you put it in those terms, Olympics actually pales by comparison with the delivery of the outcomes that government has got to do every day as part of its BAU. So whilst I'm excited about the Olympics, it's not the thing that I'm worried about in terms of broader procurement policy. Having said that, all of the Olympic procurement happens in the framework of the new policy anyway. So we are going to pick it up and we are going to see the sorts of benefits that I've talked about delivered through the Olympic frame as well. And you'll already see in terms of some of the work that Rob's team are doing, the idea of having a far more flexible supplier base. They're using the Industry Engagement Network, ICN, to start to register supplier capabilities so that when they bring tenders to market, the individual head contractors will be given access to the capability matrix to try and pick the local suppliers to engage in their supply chain. So you are seeing different behaviours already in terms of the way the policy will work.
Okay. Directly related to that, based on this new policy, is it an option to register as a local Queensland-based business and work with international suppliers in the background? Or will you, I think the subtext is here, will you have some way of making sure that's visible to the procurement officer?
Yeah. So when you look at the policy in detail, we start to talk about what's a local supplier, particularly if you're interested in trying to work out what those local benefits are. To be a Queensland-based business, you have to be registered in Queensland, have a Queensland ABN, have an office here, and have a local workforce here. So we absolutely have a way of tracking that. One of the other pieces of work that we're engaged on under the data strategy at the moment is a data exchange and a memorandum of understanding with the ABS and the ATO. And through that, for the first time ever, we'll have accurate data on the status of businesses within Queensland, including their employee size. So we'll be able to see for the first time who all of the 440,000 small businesses are in Queensland, and we'll know where they are and be able to have a much better view as to who's playing in our supply chain and what they're doing.
Okay, thank you. Can you describe, I think you may have actually mentioned this in passing, but can you describe the thresholds for the different levels of tenders at once?
So what we've done in the policy is set some new minimums. Agencies must come up to the minimum, but they can be higher than that if they want. And it will change on a category by category basis. So anything that I give you would just be what's in the policy itself. It wouldn't be necessarily what an agency might choose. So take education, for example. Education might be comfortable saying that there's a $25,000 one quote threshold now, but by the end of 3 years, they'll have to come up to the $50,000. On the other hand, if you're in the health space and you're buying medical imaging equipment, Well, you don't get those, any change for those out of $2 million. So why are you trying to set a competitive quote threshold of 50,000? You might set a much higher one for that category of goods and services.
Okay. Thank you. I have one last question in my pipeline. It comes from a former Queensland Government CIO who says, who shall remain nameless. And he says, when he was Queensland Government CIO, he banned ICT procurement initiatives that closed mid-December. And the various industry bodies and this person considered that disrespectful. So for 3 years, there were no initiatives closing mid-December, and the amount of screaming across the Brisbane CBD was greatly reduced. The very first year after he left, these initiatives returned. How can we build a level of respect between government and industry so that there can be the kind of interactions that lead to more respectful behaviours on both sides?
So we do have our Ministerial Advisory Council, which has a range of different industry representatives. Nick is one of those industry representatives. As far as I'm aware, each of the category councils now has a tendering moratorium to stop tendering occurring over the December period. And when we have spoken to industry, generally speaking, that's been well regarded. That's not to say it doesn't ever happen. Of course, right. Sometimes it will. But through the establishment of our advisory councils and the industry reference groups, I'm hoping that we give industry a much more tangible voice and that we have an opportunity for that feedback to come through. We've also, and will be doing, something that's a little bit unusual. I chair something called the Queensland Government Procurement Committee. That's the peak body for government procurement, a procurement board, if you will. And what we will be doing next year and from thereafter is inviting representatives of the IRGs to come to a special meeting of the Queensland Government Procurement Committee and provide that feedback directly to myself and the other Deputy Director Generals who make up that committee, so that we get a direct, you get actually access to decision makers directly.
Based on my experience with a whole bunch of things, including the Australian Research Council, please don't move those deadlines to mid-January. That's even worse than mid-December from the point of view of being able to take a break.
The moratorium supposedly runs from the end of the first week of December through until the end of the second week of January. So if anyone's tendering during that period, it's either for a really, really good reason or they're being non-compliant, and then we probably want to take them out the back with a stick.
Okay, sounds good. Alrighty, that winds up all of the questions that have been asked. So, Andrew, thank you so much for answering them all so patiently and so fully. Hold on, we have one new question. Wait. It says, we were advised recently that the vendor panel portal would take over from the Q tenders portal. It sounds like we still need to be using two portals. Please advise. And specifically, this seems to be around ICT recruitment.
So we are in the process of connecting. Yeah, we're in the process of connecting the two systems a lot closer together. The vendor panel tool is great for delivering a procurement process. It's not terribly good at providing visibility of opportunities as they come to market. So register through Q tenders, but they'll be delivered through the vendor panel product, unless you're talking about contingent labour, and contingent labour currently still lives in the field glass tool, and we're going to be reviewing that this year.
Okay, thank you. Right, so Nick and Andrew, I think that concludes all our questions just in time, and I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thanks for running the questions. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. As Andrew indicated, CICTA works closely with the government on procurement. I sit on the, Andrew and his team kindly allow me to sit on the Minister's Procurement Advisory Council. We also, as part of the CICTA executive, are part of the, I think it's called the Industry Advisory Council for the ICT category. And that's run out of Minister Miniken, I think's department. But I mean, it all operates together as part of the procurement arrangement. So CICTA itself will provide those, and also we will ultimately, as we do roundtables, provide an ability, we hope, if there are issues, whether there are any or not, anything that comes back as feedback, from the policy as it goes into action will be wanting to take back to government to offer congratulations or opportunities for making a change. So keep posted, and we'll be doing, I hope, more of these webinars to enable the industry to keep up to date with various things. It therefore really only falls to me now to thank Andrew very much indeed for an excellent presentation and for being so willing and able to answer all of these the procurement questions. I think, in fact, not that I in any way want to compare us with the Business Council, because I would never do such a thing, but just to say that I think it allowed us even more questions than were possible for the dinner that you had to pay for, the lunch that you had to pay for. But of course,
better value. There you go.
Excellent value for money on that basis. So thank you very much, Andrew. We much appreciate your time this morning and for your willingness to engage with everybody here today.
You're very welcome. Thanks very much, Nick.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us. That'll be our last CICTA event, I think, before Christmas. So Merry Christmas and a very happy New Year. We'll look forward to seeing you again in the new year. Thank you, everyone.
Merry Christmas to you too, Nick.
Thanks.